Hello and welcome to Questioning Mind. I'm your host Sagarika, and today I'm joined by Amritanshu Pandey. He's been on the channel before. Welcome. Amrit and I have co-authored an article on the AI tree discussion as it stands in India, and that is where we will be beginning our discussion today. Amrit is a scholar in Indic history as well as the author of historical fiction. So it's going to be a pretty great discussion, and I'm going to ask just a few questions that will take us back to the outlines of the article that we co-authored about AIT and its actual standing in Indian socio-political context today, how it affects our history and our understanding of our own civilization, and then move on to solely your framework of how you perceive an alternative to AIT, or now it's AMT, so the AIMT debate. And we will go to the framework that you've actually come up with quite recently, at least in terms of making it public. So yeah, I really look forward to this discussion. Thank you so much for coming on again.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so to begin with, can you lay the groundwork for how the Aryan Invasion Theory was initially conceptualized?
So yeah, I mean, as I keep saying, when we talk about Aryan invasion theory, migration theory, and that's where we should get to. But it begins, it's a corollary to a base theory. It begins with a theory of comparative linguistics. And that theory hits upon an intuition that was starting to develop amongst Europeans due to different observations, that languages may have some kind of relationship to each other, such that there could be conceptualized a language family tree. So that notion was there. And by this time, they started discovering uncanny similarities between Sanskrit, between Greek, between Latin. The relationship between, let us say, the Greek pantheon and the Roman pantheon. Mm-hmm. These were things they were already well versed with before they reached India, observed Sanskrit, and found even further connections with the Vedic pantheon. So when these observations were being made, the theory developed that these languages are related to each other, that they are related to each other such that they descend from a common mother language. So this is the heart of the matter, that the observation being made is that the nature of relationship between these languages is that they have a common mother language. But that is just a hypothesis. And therefore, the best name we can call that mother language is Proto-Indo-European, because these languages are Indo-European languages. So that's the core notion. And implicit with this is that if there is this thing called the Indo-European language families, then this is separate to another thing called the Dravidian language families. And that's separate to yet another thing, the Austroasiatic language families. So this is the whole tree as it branches. So once this was conceived that there was something PIE, Proto-Indo-European, they asked some questions that likely came to them quite obviously, that where was it first spoken? Who were the people that spoke it? When was it spoken? And in what ways did it disperse from this speculative homeland to everywhere else in Eurasia? So that's the base. And now to this question, that where was it first spoken? The moment you put a point on Eurasia anywhere outside India, you are forced to start talking about some kind of Aryan invasion or migration. Because if the homeland was outside India, then by definition, at some point it came in through dispersal. So that is what starts creating Aryan invasion, Aryan migration theory as a corollary. And of course, then now we can get into why is it that the homeland is not posited to be India at all? What were the early intuitions? Why did they think that Sanskrit could not be a mother language? Or did they think that Sanskrit was a mother language? So there's a whole trajectory to that. But this is the broad layout.
All right, thank you. So basically, it originates from the idea of comparative linguistics, the definition of first Proto-Indo-European, and then who brought the Proto-Indo-European language to India because they were aware of it being part of the European ethnography. It was spoken by a lot of ethnicities within Europe. And then, but they found similarities in India, so it was directly posited that Europeans must have come to India at some point in time. So the concept of Aryan, I've heard it described as an ethnonym, but mistaken to be an ethonym instead. Basically,
the other way around, right? You're talking about Kerwin's framing of this, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So Kerwin says it's not an ethnonym; it's an etonym.
Sorry. It's an etonym, but it's mistaken to be an ethnonym by a lot of scholars. That is that they belong to a particular cultural ethos and not an ethnicity. So is that the way that the word Arya is used? The word Dāsas or Dravidas are used, not Dravidas, really Dāsas and Aryas. Is that how it is used in Indic literature?
It varies. So the earliest testimony we would have to go to is the Rig Veda. But there is a priori, we shouldn't think that the word Arya, as it might appear in the Rig Veda, is the same meaning of Arya in the Mahabharata. We would have to investigate this before we find that out. Now, and I'm not commenting yet on Kerwin's point, the point you raised about ethnonym, we can get there. But in the Rig Veda itself, there is fair reason to speculate that at that time, at the Rig Vedic stage, the term Arya might indeed have had an ethnic connotation. Now, what is the reason to say so? Well, and here we are primarily led by the discoveries or the research of Shrikant Talagerisa. But he makes the interesting observation that the word Arya in the Rig Veda is reserved exclusively for the Puru Bharats, which is one branch, which is one tribe in the Rig Veda. And they are, by most accounts, this is somewhere where even AIT, AMT scholars and OIT scholars tend to agree. So very few people contest this, that the Rig Veda is kind of, the people of the book are the Puru Bharats in the Rig Veda. It is them, they are the protagonists. It is their kings for whom the Purohits are invoking the gods, etc. So when they say Arya, they do seem to be talking about their tribal ethnicity. And such that even if they have friends, allies who are not of their tribe, they do not call them Arya. And when they have members of their own tribe who are an enemy, they still call them Arya. So this is something we should respect, at least as a fact of the matter. And now, despite this, if we may want to interpret it differently, then that's a direction to take. But that's what it appears from the data in the Rig Veda. Fast forward to the Mahabharata, which looking at Rig Vedic chronology, towards the end of the Rig Vedic period, we have a rishi called Parashar. He has a son Ved Vyas, and from there, so they are connected temporally, quite adjacent. But by the Mahabharata's time, the ethnic connotation has completely gone. So here, when someone is being referred to as an Arya or not an Arya, it is clearly on the basis of ethos. It is clearly on the basis of some kind of ethical considerations. So what was an ethnonym in the Rig Veda has by now become an ethonym by the Mahabharata. And that is where it remained as a concept, as a virtue, as an aspiration for Indian civilization. So in general, we cannot say that it was a racial term, it was an ethnic term. No. In general, it had a different meaning to our civilization. And let us also notice that even though the Puru Bharats used the term Arya in an ethnic sense, their counterparts in Iran, the Indo-Iranians, they also used the term Arya for themselves in an ethnic sense. So the term was being used with ethnic exclusivity, but it was being used by different people. Which means that already its kind of universalization had begun.
That's quite interesting that, from across the world, people would use the same ethnic connotation for themselves. However, we'll just move forward a little bit and come on to the practical aspects of the theory itself, the hypothesis, the way it was postulated. And the reason that this is interesting is that these discussions are quite normal and scholastic in academic circles to have comparative linguistics gained quite a lot of followership as well as scholarship in terms of figuring out the chronology of civilization as a whole. So in India, though, it's taken on a lot of political notes.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of now there's a lot of data that is mixed into the whole aspect of comparative of philology to add genetics and archaeology. And there's when these questions arise, sometimes they say bots don't speak, as you've written in your article, and then there's also the initial idea that bots or chariots do speak. So
That's
so why do you think why did this happen? Why did Aryan invasion theory gain those political colorings, connotations at all in India?
That's a great point. Yeah, indeed. So that's a great point. And in fact, that is something that should be exposed and should be outlined such that people are aware of some of the realities of how this thing has moved ahead. So let us start, in fact, from that imaginary past, right? From this era when there were Vedic Aryans, there were Greeks living in Greece, and there was this Indo-European people spread across Eurasia. So let us notice that we have examples of Greek encounters with India. So we can say that at that time, the Greek mind, it had no colonial, it had no racist, it had no superiority as it engaged with the Indian civilization. In fact, the Greeks, for their deity Dionysus, one of their beliefs was that the first Dionysus had come from India. So that's where it starts from. And it is that the shadow of that glory of India, of that mystique of India, under which the early, middle century, the Middle Age Europeans started to come to India. So they came to India with that shadow in their mind of this great mysterious civilization. Within that context, within this small period of time, when they noticed these early similarities, this first generation was not possessed of that colonial supremacy because European ascendancy hadn't arrived yet. So the European mind was still looking to India as this civilization of mystique. But that changed very quickly. So the first generation of scholars who might have talked about Proto-Indo-European, you can clearly see that they have no compunction in discussing whether Sanskrit is the mother tongue, in discussing whether it is the most archaic, in discussing India's position as a possible cradle of civilization. But that was a very small sliver of history because then colonial ascendancy came. And with this is where we need to understand that what we are talking about, this is how one civilization may have looked at another. This is how one civilization with its own psychology, with its own view of reality, looked at some things, some aspects, and made a story about a different civilization. That is what's happening over here. So when this psychological change came about, immediately a resistance set in to certain lines of thinking. So the line of thinking which might take you to conclude that Sanskrit could have contributed to your civilization, the Europeans. So a line of thinking where Sanskrit would be in your ancestry, that line of thinking became averse to them. A line of thinking where their ancestry, their culture, their civilization came from these brown people, in the subcontinent that they were now starting to conquer, in a subcontinent of savages, of barbarians, with 1,000 different beliefs, with resistance to the word of God that they were spreading. In that environment, you could not think of, that psychology could not think of Sanskrit as the mother in any case. So within this then, they started developing all kinds of narratives which would allow them to reflect into the past what they were doing then. Because what they were doing then was coming in as foreigners into a native civilization. They were inserting into this native civilization their own paradigms at force, at coercion, at psychological manipulation. So they reflected this, whether consciously or unconsciously, into how they perceived the past. And so it became very easy for them to think that, oh, so in the past, how might have Sanskrit come to India? In a similar way. Our own ancestors maybe, from the steppe grasslands, white like us, or golden-eyed like us, would have done something similar. So that is the Aryan invasion paradigm, which is nothing but the European mind, I think maybe almost trying to find a cognitive ease for what it was doing, because what it was doing was horrendous. So perhaps if it was able to tell itself that this has happened before and see it keeps happening, maybe that's how they were able to live with themselves. So this is important. This is something that, and it's not that we're calling people racist. It's not that we are dismissing Proto-Indo-European by saying, oh, it's a racist theory, don't bother. No, we can engage with the facts of the matter. But yes, it is important to understand the psychology of the people who were engaging with these facts.
Well, that's very interesting to note that initially, they had they were basically setting a historical precedent using an academic theory, derived primarily from comparative linguistics, and then, creating a framework that we discussed in our article about creating the.
Sorry, one point, if I could just add one point, we skipped the time for it. So let us also note, though, that comparative linguistics, though, in its formal form, was born after their study of Sanskrit grammar, after their study of Sanskrit etymology, after this study of Sanskrit dhatus and ways to build up words. It's on the basis of that comparative linguistics was created. Comparative linguistics gave birth to Proto-Indo-European, and Proto-Indo-European then came back to India to tell India its own history. That's the kind of weird cycle that happened. So yeah, please continue.
Yeah, so I was just suggesting that we did mention the tautological framework of these constructs once hypothesized. If it's accepted as reality, then as we've seen, it becomes really easy to fit in archaeological and genetic or any other hard sciences into that framework. So we had, I think, Professor Shinde was. I have to go back and look, but in the Rakhigarhi excavations, when the report was, when the papers were formally published, the lack of genetic evidence of any sort of different invading race per se was fit into both frameworks, one for the Aryan migration theory, since it didn't match timelines, and one for those against the theory, saying that, well, there was no migration in the first place. So just to clarify for the viewers, can you suggest what makes the Aryan civilization in terms of archaeological and genetic markers? What would define the Aryan civilization? How did this concept come to be?
Yeah, I mean, so that, sorry, that raises some very essential questions here, right? So again, if we always must remind ourselves to start from the base. So it started as something linguistic. Now we must notice what assumptions start coming in above this, and whether there is a reason for those assumptions or they are actually presumptions. So for example, one of the things implicit in the current model is that the Proto-Indo-European people possessed some kind of cultural kit. Let's call it a cultural kit. And in this cultural kit, there was a pantheon. So there were maybe, names of nature gods and so on. And when we see that there is some kind of relationship between the Vedic pantheon and the Greek pantheon, so we know that these have inherited something from that culture kit. So we know from the model itself that Indo-European inherited its cultural kit from Proto-Indo-European. Okay, fair enough. But Proto-Indo-European, 2000 years before that, would have had its own mother, Proto-Indo-European. So it also would have inherited its own cultural kit from that mother tongue. So how do you have a way of determining what is the cultural kit? How much of it descends? Where did Proto-Indo-European get its own cultural kit from? And what part of it from where? The reason why this is important is that we need to have strong reasons to talk about Aryans as anything more than the linguistic speakers of Indo-European. This is where we are actually allowed to only say, but we start saying more because of those assumptions that are built into it. And therefore, of course, this is a whole notion of Aryan culture. So that came again from the European mind. It was the European mind extending its superiority complex, let's call it, but it was also experiencing that superiority at that time. So it was extending that consciously, subconsciously into any model it was building. And so these people, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, they became the harbingers of culture, of civilization, and therefore Aryan culture, Aryan civilization, wherever you saw goodness or greatness of civilization, it must have come from those foreign origins. And that, of course, kept getting perpetrated more and more.
All right. So just to sort of reiterate my question in a way that brings in those archaeological and genetic markers as well.
Yeah. Oh, right. That's the, sorry. Right. Now I remember. Sorry, I had missed that point. So yes. And so therefore, unnoticed or noticed, they started adding now more things to this definition of who were the Proto-Indo-European people or who were the Aryans. So for example, they added to this the notion that they were horse riders. Now, this itself they added because in the Rig Veda, they found the word Ashva, they associated that with the horse. There's a whole story there. But Aryans, who were they? They were horse riders. Along with this, they added another notion called Rath or chariots. So who were they? They were these horse riders, they were these chariot innovators. And then they were fire worshippers. So clearly they must have been building fire altars in the steppe grassland somewhere. All of these assumptions start getting built in, which give leading questions for any archaeological or genetic finding which comes later in India. So, and all of this, by the way, had happened before we discovered the Indus Valley civilization. So at that time, the people who are making these theories, they have no idea that there is something called Harappa or Mohenjo-daro. They think that, okay, you know, the Chandragupta Maurya Empire and some archaeological trajectories before that of a few centuries, that's it. They have no clue Indian history before that. And they've already made up these stories. So when the Indus Valley civilization was discovered, and that was the first major archaeological shift, it was just a lot of retrofitting. So, Aryans were supposed to have horses. Okay, so are there horses here? No, then this is not Aryans. Oh, Aryans were supposed to have chariots. So do we find chariots here? No, then this is not Aryans. So they started drawing these, exclusivities with a priori thinking. And to this, of course, they added their weird readings of the Rig Veda. So in the Rig Veda, they saw war between, light-skinned people and dark-skinned people. They projected that okay, this Indus Valley civilization were the dark-skinned inhabitants of India. Foreigners came, destroyed them. So that is the archaeological landscape, and it's now now it's starting to get questioned. And here we must always take note of Sri Dr. B.B. Lal, whose experience, whose journey is very telling on this matter, because as a young archaeologist, he got this paradigm on his own. And so he never questioned it. It was an obvious paradigm to him. So when he discovered archaeological sites of what are called the painted gray ware culture, he automatically fitted this and said, okay, this is archaeological marker of the Aryans, and hence proved. And of course, that made him famous and a darling of India's mainstream historians. But luckily for us, he was a man of curiosity, of intellectual honesty, and he realized one day that, wait a minute, this was all tautological thinking. He went back to the drawing board and looked at the findings afresh. So now he's the one who can articulate best the archaeological continuity of Indian civilization, which of course is not accounted for in Aryan invasion migration models.
All right, I just want
then genetics we can come to, yeah.
Sure. I just want to specify for the viewers that the dark-skinned and the light-skinned aspect of the Rig Veda that Amrit mentioned right now, it's not actually there in the Rig Veda.
Not at all. No, not at all.
And Professor Michel Denino, along with several other scholars, have pointed this out, that it was nothing to do with race or skin color as projected by European scholarship.
And just to give people a sense of how ridiculous that notion is at get-go, no one, someone no less than Dr. Ambedkar, he also said that, no, this is not a case of, Aryans versus Dravidians and Dāsas. He made the obvious conclusion that Aryans and Dāsas in the Rig Veda, they are dialectical cousins. So they are linguistic relatives, they're speaking a very common dialect, and it's not a big difference. So even he noticed it, it's that obvious actually.
So now Aryans and Dāsas, we'll come to the genetic aspect. Aryans and Dāsas are like you said, linguistic cousins. Now, the languages spoken by the tribes are not very far apart.
Yeah.
What gave rise to, where in the sociological framework does the concept of Dravidians being we noticed that the European scholars said that, okay, now that it's been retrofit into the archaeological evidence is retrofit into the Aryan migration or invasion model, now we must say that the Aryans came and destroyed these civilizations, pushing them farther down. Now, archaeologically or genetically, how far up away from truth or fiction is this?
It's neither, because it is fiction itself. So it is as far from fiction as another fiction. I wonder if this might help people visualize what's happening here. You see, if you decide, let us say that you want to buy a new car, and let us even say that in your mind you've figured out that, okay, I'm buying the Maruti Swift. People will attest to this. They start noticing the Maruti Swift a lot more on the road. Once it is in their mind that, yes, I am prospecting in the market for a Maruti Swift, they start seeing Maruti Swift everywhere. So this is exactly what has happened at a grand scale with Indologists, with historians, that they had this Maruti Swift in mind, and now everything is Maruti Swift to them. So Dravidians, first of all, let us notice the obvious. It's a Sanskrit term. So it's not a Tamil term. It's a Sanskrit term. It is not used in the Rig Veda. So Rig Veda has Dāsas. The Dravidian is found much later in attestation. And it is a very geographic, a plainly geographic appellation. Not even an appellation, by the way, for South India or for Southern India or for south of the Vindhyachal. No, for a small concentrated part of modern day Tamil Nadu, maybe it straddles Andhra Pradesh as well. That is what it is, nothing more. But yes, once they made those connections, that Aryas and Dāsas, and they posited that Dāsas were the original inhabitants of the Indus Valley civilization. Now, there are things that they don't tell us. It is those amongst us who research this skeptically who find these things out. Again, Shrikant Talagiri sir, you will have to keep naming him. So in the Iranian dialect, the Sanskrit S sound becomes the Iranian H sound, which is how the Sanskrit Sindhu became the Iranian Hindu, and today that is back to being our name. But the word Dāsa of the Rig Veda is directly attested in the Zend Avesta, the Iranian tradition, as Dahe. It's the same word. And there, the Iranians, the Dahe, are part of them. It's their tribe. So these early linguistics, these early scholars, it's not that they didn't know these things. They saw it. And anyone honest or remotely competent will make the obvious conclusion. So they knew that this thing will not stand too long. It doesn't have the legs for eternity. And then, of course, they're playing fancy free with everything in literature. So they're looking at Sanskrit literature as if it's, for them to pick and choose from. They are the experts of it. These Indians themselves don't even know what they've inherited from their ancestors. So they found this word Dravid, and there are no rules. And how does it become Dravidian? How do Dravidians suddenly become the ethnic Dāsas of the Rig Veda? There's nothing to be said for this. Of course, yes, there was some information they were taking from linguistic observations about what was being understood as the nature of Dravidian languages, the connection of Dravidian languages to Indo-European languages. There too, it's a very long story, but yes, they were trying to draw some easy binaries over there.
So just to sort of encapsulate this in terms of archaeology, first we created the AIT framework within which we suggested that Aryans invaded India and Indian lands at some point, brought a civilizational, cultural kit, and dispersed it amongst native Indians. And then when we find excavations of Harappa and all the Indus Valley civilizations, then we retrofit all of the evidence into saying that these were not the Aryans, these were actually indigenous people, dark-skinned people of the Vedas. Now, this is also based on the mistranslation that we discussed previously. These are the people that were pushed outside, pushed away, pushed down to the south. Now, when we come to the Dravidian concept, Dravidian is basically a language family that
so then use that name, And that itself is an arbitrary name. So exactly, please continue. But yes, let us notice that this one arbitrary word of geographic appellation used in Sanskrit, Dravid, that has now become the name for a different language family, the Dravidian. So, there are no rules. But yeah, please continue.
Well, we've had that with OCP culture as well. And so
absolutely, we talked about that last time. Yeah,
we did. So I'm going to link that talk up on somewhere on the channel above as a card. Also, so when we discuss Dravidian as a language family, what is the timeline? When did this
yes, amazing stories, and that's a great question. And that's also something people should always wonder, that India has so many different language families. So the Indian story is never complete with just the story of one language family. Funnily enough, they have found ways to even conjecturize that Dravidian also came from outside. Lo and behold. So we have a scholar of the name Asko Parpola.
Yes.
Now, for Asko Parpola, it is, I forget, and the people who look it up can please correct me for this. His theory is that there was some kind of linguistic, ethnogenesis homeland straddling modern day Iran and south of the Caucasus Sea, etc., Caspian Sea, I believe. And there we had protoforms of Indo-European and Dravidian, according to his model. And Dravidian came into India in the first wave, who are actually the Dāsas of the Rig Veda. And then pushing them further in were the Aryans in the second wave, who brought Indo-European languages. So, he is, of course, entitled to all of his imagination. It's just that we need not entertain them over much. So, but yes, just to point out that theory does exist. That said, no, there are other linguists who are saner at least, and they have no compunction in confessing that yes, Dravidian seems quite indigenous to the southern tip of the Indian subcontinent. It does seem like a language that might have dispersed coastally across India's long history, which is one way to explain the existence of Dravidian language families, both in modern day Balochistan and near modern day Bengal, because it's all along the coastline. So that's the narrative for that, for Dravidian. And yeah. The way it intersects, of course.
Sorry, do we have a timeline? Because the dialect is a much later one. It's maybe 1,000 years or slightly more.
Yeah. So for Dravidian itself, I personally do not remember the timelines. Mm-hmm. What I am more certain of is that in the attested record, Tamil comes into the attested record earliest in the first millennium BC. Mm-hmm. However, every time we've looked at these things, the attested record is not really the best way to conclude the matter. And I'm quite inclined to take on the supposition of Kiran Varanasi, or at the rate Vakibs on Twitter, that proto-forms even of Kannada, etc., could have existed at that time or prior to that. We should not bottle our thinking so closely. So that's what we know from a tested thing. But of course, it is already impugned that in the Rig Veda, we find what is called a Dravidian substratum. So these are fancy things linguistics do to, again, keep self-perpetuating their imaginations. So a substratum, the concept they say is that if you find substratum in Sanskrit, that means that Sanskrit has come over an existing language and somehow borrowed something from that language. So if they say that Dravidian is a substratum in Sanskrit, what they're saying is that Dravidian would have already been there. Sanskrit came to this land from somewhere else and then picked up something from Dravidian. So when they call it a substratum, that's one of their ways to again perpetuate that, okay, Dravidians were natives, they were already here, someone came from outside, that kind of thing.
Do we see the same analogy applied to Latin, or do we see the same analogy applied to any Austroasiatic languages or anything where a substratum is used, for the mother language to have picked from, or some? Is that
so substratum? It is a legitimate way to explain how one language may interact with another language. There is substratum, there is a concept of adstratum. So, but these are just ways to explain what might have been the temporal and spatial relationship between two languages. So if language A already exists here, that means it is spatio-temporally first, and a new language comes in, then whatever the new language picks up is called a substratum. But if there are two languages that are coexistent and they pick up from each other, that is called an adstratum. But how do you determine what is substratum, what is adstratum? Unless you already have an a priori theory that, okay, this will be the substratum language. So they already conclude because of their own prior conceptions that Dravidian was here. So anyway, if they find Dravidian in Sanskrit, they're going to call it substratum, but that's not a proof of anything but itself.
All right, so back to the tautology. Again, going back to, so this helps me secure into the genetics aspect now. That is something that is used to bolster the claim of Dravidians being a very separate race that spoke a separate language, who are genetically distinct from the Aryans, so-called Aryans of the Aryan migration theory. I still want to have this question answered before this. Is the adstratum substratum correlation applied to to any other language by saying that it was brought
So
the outside and correlated to race factors, etc.?
No, so substratum, adstratum, it's used across the board, yes, as these as models of linguistics itself. But certainly the kind of hard passion, the kind of hard boundaries, the kind of a priori thinking with which it has been applied in India, substratum, Dravidian as a substratum, and then never questioned for many decades because new generations of scholars were taking it accepted for granted. You probably won't find that kind of analogy elsewhere. But the thing is that they are, we know substratum does exist. And so therefore, one cannot question substratum itself. They will say, oh, so that means you don't understand.
My question is that correlating it to a race or to an invasion as such, has that happened?
Invasions, yes. Race, again, language and race, they've always been correlating this across the world. Yes, they do it in the case of Austroasiatic as well. They've done it in the case of, I forget the language family, I think it's called Austronesian, which spreads over to Australia, Polynesia. But certainly, I mean, the story of languages, language families has been led many times by conscious or subconscious racism or racial notions, no doubt. Yeah.
Right. So this seemed like a legitimate theory for the time when this was an accepted practice anyway. All right. So now moving on to the genetic aspect of the Aryan-Dravidian divide, or that, this is important because it continues into the present day. We actually have political parties establishing supremacy in a particular region, stating that they were indigenous, and then we have a lot of Aryan supremacists. Well, they're few and far in between. At least it does not affect politics as much as it does sociology. It affects caste divides, etc. So, what does genetics bring into this aspect of Aryan Dravidian debate?
So it hits at the heart of the matter because so let us start first of all again before we get to genetics. Let us ask of language that how might language have originated, language itself, and where might it have originated? Now, we don't need to unpack the whole detail. The consensus view right now is that language likely had a single point of origin, which means that some proto-primeval language was somehow generated by some primitive human beings. It might not even have been Homo sapiens, because maybe Neanderthals also had language. We don't even know that for sure. But it was one single point in time, which is to say it is analogous to how we think of, first of all, the human species. So because we actually are able to trace back our earliest maternal ancestor, I think her name is Lucy, and it is a genetic reality that every single human being today is descended from Lucy. So all human ancestry converges with Lucy at the source. This is the kind of intuition that is then generated for language as well, which is to say that in any case, we have been thinking about language movements somehow in the way we think of genes and genetic movements. And the analogies are many. So today, Bhojpuri and Awadhi are considered dialects, and they are dialects of Hindi. And Hindi is considered a language. We can, of course, allow for the plausibility that if this continues and somehow there is some divergence also between them, one day Bhojpuri will be a language of its own, will it not? And Awadhi, a language. That is, in fact, how things happen. That is exactly how it happens with species. So today, two variants of a species, and then if they diverge too much, they become two whole species. So all of the same analogies and thinking exists. Then the seminal work or breakthrough in this came from the work of, I struggle at pronouncing the name correctly, Cavalli Sforza, I think is the name of the researcher. And he found some good statistical evidences and proof to find out that, yes, our languages, linguistic family trees do in fact kind of move, flow, and disperse in correlation with genetic family trees. It's a general statistical likelihood and principle that he was able to discern, which does not say anything conclusively, because in reality, our set of genetic ancestors is not always the same as our set of linguistic ancestors. And all of us who are listening to this video will, of course, agree with that, because I do not think any of us have British ancestry over here, but we have British ancestry in our language. So we have it in our linguistic ancestry. Therefore, there are reasons to correlate these. Yes, there are no rules. There are no predictive models that, oh, you can predict for sure that this is how they will move together. This is how they will correlate. So since the intuition was there, and since linguists, I think, we can feel some pity for them, right? Because they, sit in their rooms, they come up with these arcane reconstructions. I'm sure they put a lot of thought to roots and to sounds, and I'm sure they convince themselves that what they've done is, it happens with me. I think about something all night. By the morning, I think, oh, what I've come up with is something revelatory, but I may share it with a friend, and the friend will give me a reality check that no, that's not the case. So linguists, no one has been giving them reality checks, and they want validation. So they were first desperate for archaeological proof. When archaeology started disproving them, they said, oh, well, it's a linguistic theory. Please don't bring in archaeology. But then they started fantasizing for genetic proof. They felt that because linguistic and genetic trees are correlated, they move in similar ways. If it can be proven genetically, it becomes proof for our field. And we know this because Michael Witzel has been talking about yet to be found genetic evidence, long before genetic evidence came. So yeah, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to go back to the scholar that you mentioned offering statistical evidence. But we've seen throughout history, like you mentioned, you and I speak English, and it's obviously not part of our genetic ancestry. We've seen that happen with the Sakas. We've seen that happen with the Mongols. We've seen that happen across history, right? So is that a counter statistical evidence that proves otherwise, or is there not enough research in this area?
No, I mean, so all he found was that, okay, there is a correlation, statistic. So one doesn't need correlation is anyway not causation. So it is just association. But what it gave was, some kind of mental hooks for people to use, some kind of mental intuitions for people to use. And again, immediately there were linguists and genetists to immediately remind us that that doesn't mean you start taking your linguistic ancestors and your genetic ancestors to be congruent. So it's the kind of thing that they will notice when it hits because it supports the cause. But they won't tell you when it doesn't, and you are not sitting there looking for genetic data every day. So the genetic tapestry of our species, it is immensely complex, and so much variation, so many haplogroups, so many male paternal DNA lineages, so many maternal DNA lineages. So yeah, I mean, for them to start finding hard correlations is what we should call out. And so this is what we can unpack. But the point is that linguists were waiting for genetic evidence, and they want whatever can fit their model right away.
So when it comes to the Aryan-Dravidian divide, this is something we've covered. We've come at it from a sociopolitical aspect, but we are working on a follow-up in the gene aspect, genetics aspects as well. So where does the Dravidian language family being spoken by, you know, some people within a different region of India as opposed to the Aryan region, which is the northwestern parts of the country. When does this get conflated with genetics, with the ancient ancestral South Indian and ancient ancestral North Indian, the paper from Narasimhan et al. So, David Wright.
So, I mean, now this is, we talk about this in the paper that, the article that we published, right? So we keep talking about self-fulfilling prophecies. So the slippery trick with the self-fulfilling prophecy is that when you ask, okay, so when did it start getting conflated? The answer could almost be from the inception. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So from the inception, those paradigms of thinking are getting subconsciously layered, on which new data will just be fit for cognitive ease, which is to say that prior to any genetic data coming onto the table, there is already unquestioned a notion of Aryan race, Dravidian race. This notion has already been neatly mapped onto India such that, oh, North India, okay, Aryan race, South India, okay, Dravidian race. Aryan race is exactly congruent already to Aryan language speakers. Dravidian race is exactly congruent to Dravidian language. So all of this is already there as layers and layers of tautology, Now, when they found, so then the first thing we have to now talk about is what you exactly mentioned, ancient ancestral South Indians, ancient ancestral North Indians. So this is, I think it is 2017 when this paper that talks about this did come out. If I'm wrong on the mistake on the date, then that's a mistake. But they found that, okay, there is a base layer of genetics or genetic lineages in the Indian population, which is from more than 65,000 years ago. So it is extremely primordial. It is extremely long, deeply rooted in India. There are parts of lineages from that have gone out of India and have been formative for the ancestries of Australia, formative for the ancestries of Japan, formative for the ancestries of East Asia. So that is this first layer. And what they noticed was that at some point, there was influx into this layer of something from India's northwest, of some other genetic lineages. Now, because there already exists in their mind the category and the box, Aryan Dravidian, North Indian, South Indian, what do? They call that base layer of genetic lineages ancient ancestral South Indians. And again, I might be wrong on the technicalities, but to this, we also had, I think, an even ancient one, which is called Andaman ancestry. So it is even more deeply rooted in the subcontinent. But anyway, so they decided that let us call this base layer ancient ancestral South Indians. And this layer that has now come from outside, ancient ancestral North Indians. That genetics does not use words to describe itself. Ancient, ancestral, North Indians, all of these are words of our creation being put onto genetic data, to DNA being passed from father to son, mother to daughter. These arbitrary categories. So the concept then kind of was self-fulfilling prophecy. So therefore it came about when? Forever. It was just waiting for the discovery to be made. When the discovery of this genetic fact was made, one is South Indian, one is North Indian, unquestioned, and they didn't even challenge it. So, but it is tautology. I mean, it is proof of nothing actually beyond itself.
We do have genetic differences in the southern part of India, in the northern part of India. This has also been mapped to, actually, this is a discussion that can go on for a really long time, and I'd love to segue into the alternative that you've offered as well. So I'm just gonna.
Let's parse this.
All right. So because the genetic evidence at this point suggests that, there's a lot of distinct genetic tribalism, say, involved in the north and the south, but it also does not consider a lot of the the tribal populations, the existing, indigenous populations who do not
Mhm.
have, who are part of the northern Indian geography, but do not have the ANI gene, or what is
Mhm.
called
Mhm.
the ANI gene. I'm just thinking now that it's intellectually or scientifically dishonest to already call it the North Indian gene without any evidence for
There you
it.
go. That's the point. That's the point.
Without any evidence for it existing in all of
Yeah.
North India. However,
In fact, I think this is, I may be wrong on the details of this anecdote here, but I think the researchers first wanted to call it ancestral North Indian,
North India,
ancestral
yes,
South Indian.
yes, yes, it is.
But there were some Indian researchers in the team who expressed concern that, wait, this
Mhm.
is actually going to, evoke unnecessarily something else. I don't know how they felt that, okay, it's a fair compromise to now just add the word,
Ancient.
ancient to it. So that, oh, it's ancient ancestral North Indian, ancient ancestral South Indian. Tell that to, I don't know, parties calling themselves Dravidian today, that it's ancient ancestral, as if that will make a difference to their divisive agendas. So,
So just again another example where we have a genetically diverse population speaking linguistically different family using a
mhm.
different language family. So why is that not a distinction that we should make apart from the, say, civic nationalism or pluralism of the
Mhm.
country? Do we see a
Mhm.
civilizational continuum when it comes to the Dravidians and the Aryans that are categorized according to the AIT discussion?
So for one, of course, I will not never say for anything that we should not, and even if it is something of academic curiosity, I cannot deny to someone else their curious pursuit just as much as they cannot deny me mine. So sure, I mean, if someone has this agenda that we are just trying to find out the genetic story, that's not what we're calling out. That's not what's problematic, because you see, let's think of this in terms of common sense. So let us think of this very neutrally. That first remove India from the picture. So we know that, okay, we have all of these different human beings across the planet. Some of us have different skin color, some of us have different ethnicity. But we, even as we go about trying to find out, lineages, movements of ancient genetic dispersals, that remains an academic pursuit, right? We know otherwise fundamentally that, okay, we have a common ancestry starting from Africa, we are one species, and we don't start using this to form divisions between human groups at a planetary level, right? We used to. People should realize that we used to. So there used to be a different way where we could do it. It used to be called race. And race was also a science. And race was something where they had determined that, okay, this is the Caucasoid race, this is the Mongoloid race, etc. So it has been done once before. But with genetics, because of genetics being far more complex than race, having absolutely no perhaps physical features or markers at all, being totally internal, this wasn't possible. And it doesn't make sense, right? So this is the point where I said, let's just think about common sense. It's obvious that surely there may have been so many genetic lineages moving in and out across the planet. We know that at one point, we maybe killed out the Neanderthals. At some point we crossed the Bering Strait, we reached the North American continent. I don't know, millennia before Christopher Columbus made his blunder. So yes, this is an obvious fact, and there is nothing wrong in tracing these trails and in finding them fascinating. Example. So this is why I said that. So let us take the outward example first. The academic curiosity that the oldest maternal ancestry of Japan can be traced to origins in India. A genetic fact.
Mhm.
So have we stopped here? It's a fascinating fact. I love thinking about it that, wow, what a kind of trek would that have been? Surely it wouldn't have been one generation who made that trek, right? Maybe they stopped at modern day Beijing somewhere. Great things to think about. Are we going to Japan today? Are we starting to find out, okay, who in Japan today has what percentage of this ancestry? Are we starting to call them ancient ancestral Indian origins? And are we starting to call the other one ancient ancestral Japanese indigenous? No, we're not. Now notice that the only, one point, the only country we're doing this is the one that happens to be humanity's second primordial homeland outside of Africa. There's a known fact that outside of Africa, this has been the hotbed. So over here, it's going to be so complex, so interweaving. Therefore, it's a Rorschach test. What the pattern emerges tells more about the person who's observing the pattern than the pattern itself.
So I was talking about civilizational continuum as such, even despite the genetic differences, we've got a lot of the civilizational markers that were first attributed to the Aryans, but then they were basically seen as existing throughout the length and breadth of the nation. We've had literature talking about descriptions and geographical descriptions about the Bharatvarsha as such, about the Indic civilization. So civilizationally, we were one people, but then genetically, it is assumed that language followed genetics, and then, we somehow are divided by all of these factors now. So, but there was a civilizational continuum, right?
Absolutely, but so perhaps we should let's think aloud that okay, if we want to determine whether there was civilizational continuum or not, what would we base our decisions on? Which is to say, what is the evidence? What are the markers of civilizational continuum? Let's think aloud on this. So, for example, we can start rhetorically. Would we need genetic evidence of unbroken genetic transmission with no foreign influence and homogenized intermingling over a period of the entire continuity? Would this be a necessary condition for civilizational continuity? It's a rhetorical question, but my point is that we will need to ask this then. Because clearly genetics is not needed. Clearly this kind of homogenized genetic fidelity is not. So continuity of civilization might be based on something else. So we could go there. But over here, my point is that we always must ask, we can find 10 new facts about genetics tomorrow, 10 new divisions in Indian society, 10 new unities in Indian society. What does that say about our civilizational history? Nothing at all.
No, so in terms of civilizational history, I actually meant the textual and the textual and the archaeological evidences of the deities, of the tribal cultures.
That is what would be evidence. Correct.
They're much more tangible. So, and they're definitely not determined by gene or language. They're just, civilizational markers. And we have historic writings that describe the length and breadth of the country exactly as we know it, plus parts of Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. And of course, we've had the Sora kings invading southwards and forming and getting, embracing, indigenizing themselves in the Indonesian and Javan and Malaysian, Cambodian regions as well. So as a civilizational nation, there was no division, but then the genetic evidence combined with the linguistic evidence, and it should be considered a little bit ridiculous considering how many language families and how many actually we focused on two main divisive gene families as such, but were we to do an actual genealogy, we'd see how much diversity that really exists within the Indian continent. So we've just focused on a couple of those to ensure that we remain divisive socially and politically. Now, since we've sort of concluded this as being a little bit ridiculous and based on several tautologies, what's the alternative? You've presented your take on what is a possible alternative. Of course, the out of India theory has found many takers, but I'm just going to share my screen to bring up a simplified diagram of sorts that can you explain this framework?
So, I mean, in many ways, okay. In many ways, just right off the bat, from 5 to -1 here is what we've just done in our talk so far. We kind of talked about it. But so broadly, what am I trying to do over here? First of all, as when I started by saying that, if you place the PIE homeland anywhere outside India, you will be implying some kind of invasion migration scenario. So there are now two ways to go about this with this situation. So the first is the obvious, that, okay, you posit a PIE homeland in India. So the moment you say that the PIE homeland was in India, you have eliminated the Aryan invasion migration problem, because now you are actually postulating that Aryans were indigenous to India, and therefore IE languages dispersed out of India. So that is why it's called the out of India theory, or OIT. So that's what you can do just by shifting location of the PIE homeland. But that is beyond that level, and there are serious legitimate challenges to the entire notion of PIE, of course. So whether PIE can even be considered a language in a real sense, or should it be let it be a nominal construct for academic pursuit, which is to say that there is nothing to prove that it really was a spoken language. It is only a hypothesis of science. So therefore, there are some views to take where you can deny this unity, this thing called the Indo-European unity. You can say that that itself is a false construct. If you go down that line, you will, at least people who are linguists these days, scholars, even geneticists, archaeologists, they will expect you to at least then explain that if we do away with Indo-European unity, what does that mean for other language families? So, okay, so then are you doing away with Dravidian unity? So that's another, then the game is also a bit more complex. So this is the matter at hand, that we have an noticeable Indo-European unity that has led to a hypothesis of Proto-Indo-European. My point is that, first of all, we should understand that it is this linguistic base that leads to some kind of Aryan invasion model or migration model. Therefore, we cannot just debunk the Aryan invasion migration model. To debunk it, you have to debunk it completely. So you have to go to the source. You cannot just say Aryans didn't come to India. If you say that they were indigenous to India, you are implying that PIE was also in India. You get my point? So the PIE thing is something that we either have to give reasons for rejecting, or we have to at least make speculations that put it into India in order to then find a different truth. Yeah, please.
Because we've discussed PIE, you and I have discussed PIE. I have understanding of, however, with Aryans as such, the way Aryans are posited, it is not merely a linguistic theory anymore. There are, like,
of course.
You've mentioned that in the paper, in the article.
Yeah, so I'll just that's what, yeah.
Right. So it's based on archaeological evidence. Like you said, the cultural markers of the Aryans as such were supposed to be horses and chariots. And then, of course, a great civilization with pots and drainage systems, etc. So all of those were apparently later retrofitted, but at least initial Aryan markers were, the horse, the chariot, the
horse and chariot.
Yeah. So all of that, apart from the language. So Aryans did have other evidences. So in order to debunk the Aryan invasion theory, it's not the PIE aspect can be resolved separately, at least in order to say that the markers of an Aryan civilization were already present in the timelines posited for the invasion or migration now. Since we have no archaeological evidences of an invasion, it's come down to migration. And since there's not a lot of significant amount of migration as determined by even genetic evidences, now it's coming down to trickling down or tourism or whatever kind of theory as such. So, so apart from the language aspect of PIE, we also have the archaeological evidence. So, sorry. Let's go back to PIE. I'm just going to share the screen with the article once again so that viewers can view, some of the pointers that you've laid out as to who are the Aryans, what did they speak. We've also
okay. Yeah. So I mean, first of all, yes, that is what you said is exactly what we will get to even in this. But again, so let us look at some of the people who are at the vanguard of making the kind of arguments that you just said, and the kind of arguments that I also make. So let us just, off the cuff, Shrikant Talagiri sir, Conrad Elts sir, Michel Danino sir has his say on these things. Shri David Frawley ji says a lot about this. Dr. Nicholas Kazanas, Dr. B.B. Lal. We have the researcher Igor Tonoyan Belyayev. We have Alexander Semenenko, who is also a follower or disciple at Oroville. So these are some of the people who might, by and large, agree with what you just said, right? So in general, they would not really have much to contest on it. And they're at the vanguard of this argumentation, primary research, postulating things that then people like me can read and give as reference and pretend to be experts on the matter about. So, but those are the original researchers. Now, why is it that the original researchers are doing something else? So why is it that for them, it's they aren't just giving this kind of easy rattling down of the matter and winning the game? So what is happening? What is it that they're encountering? What is it that they're coming up with? We have to give respect to their work at least, and understand that surely there is some important work that they're doing, some new information that they're uncovering, some new paradigms that they're proposing, challenging existing paradigms. So let us understand what's happening there as a proposal. My point is that when we start doing that, so when we start looking at each and every fact, so chariots, okay, let's take chariots. Now, there is a whole reason, right, why they think chariots were originated in the steppe. There is then a whole retrofitting they did where they found something, and because they already had a belief that this is where chariots would have originated, though it was a very primitive wagon or something, they called it a true chariot. Okay. There was this another scholar who did a more intensive study of chariots in Mesopotamia, Sumer, etc., who says, no, that is not a true chariot. In the meantime, in India, for example, recently we found Sinoli chariot. This intersects with the wheel. There used to be spoke chariots. There used to be then, prior to that, non-spoke wheel chariots. There is something, the chariot is called the Rath in Sanskrit. So the Rath is there in the Rig Veda. But in many parts of the Rig Veda, the Rath is being used very clearly for a wagon, which is being pulled by an oxen. So just on this one thing, chariots, yes, we can do let's do one thing, and we do this, right? That isn't it so stupid? People from the grasslands, steppe grasslands, oh, so they trekked all the way from the steppe to India with chariots. Oh, so they crossed the Hindu Kush mountain on chariots. That's a great argument. The rhetoric is fun, and it's pointing to something deep, yes. But that hasn't ended the chariot argument, because now the entire model still requires a postulation for what is the chariot, what is the Rath, at what stage of this linguistic unity was the Rath invented. So then what common words are there found for it or not found for it? Can the Rath have been invented at two different places at two different points in time? Why does it have to be that it was invented at one place on the planet, then spread everywhere else? You see, and this is just on the Rath matter. And this
was actually originally postulated as a marker of the Aryan civilization that you actually, came to early in the discussion, that what makes the civilization such. So since this was postulated as one of the markers of what the Aryans brought in along with Sanskrit, along with their civilization and the cultural kit, that is why we've got the chariot. And so we will, maybe now that Sonali has we've excavated chariots here as well, we would hope that it would, maybe put at least one matter to rest, but it doesn't. Like you said, there's the whole idea
no,
of
for the matter to be put to rest, we would have to understand and endorse the full matter. No, but the full matter also.
No, the full matter.
It doesn't matter.
We have to go PIE, yes?
We found chariots at Senoli. Fine, we found chariots at Senoli. But we first associated chariots with Indo-European because of the evidence of Rath in the Rig Veda. Closer look reveals that Rath in the Rig Veda can anyway be a wagon, also pulled by oxen. So now what are you going to do about that original premise that, oh, chariot is something common to Indo-European? That itself collapses. Mm-hmm. If that collapses, then question again, oh, why would it have been in the steppe? So why are we looking there to begin with for some kind of evidence of? But to do this, it has taken someone like a Talagiri sir, for example, to get into the Rig Veda, to make these observations, to find out that, wow, in the entire early Rig Veda, there is no chariot. In this thing called the Battle of 10 Kings, there is no chariot. That the spoke wheel chariot, so someone had to do this discovery. Right. And that person who did this discovery did not stop only at, calling out poor intentions, prejudices, and biases. That person had to do some more street work and labor to then equip me and you to be able to talk about these things, for example. But anyway, my point is that it's just that these are things to notice, but it is interesting to do it stepwise. And the proposal I was making was that, fine, because you see, I've been having these discussions, I've been in a lot of these forums. So I know by now already a lot of the counter questions that come, a lot of the challenges that come. And it's not just me, you see scholars playing it. You have seen people who read the literature, they see how Witzel plays the game. They see how he shifts goalposts around. So I am trying to prepare a framework that people know that this is how it's going to happen. This is what they're going to try and do. These are the boxes they're going to yes.
Framework.
And so therefore, how do you adopt a position to be able to counter that? That is the objective here. So for that, I propose that, okay, let us be nice, decent people who are just taking this as an intellectual matter. Why? So that off the bat, you can't dismiss me because I'm being chauvinistic or I'm being, very overtly nationalistic. No, fine. I will look at what the theory is. We start with the base theory, which is a linguistic theory. That's the whole PIE matter. Okay. So that's the starting. Then we notice how PIE to theek hai. But as you said, it's also about Aryan invasion, Aryan migration. So once we look at the linguistic theory, let's now look at why is it being postulated that there was some kind of Aryan invasion, migration into India. Then let us look at how they started talking about archaeological evidence. So they started demanding that, oh, where are these horse bones if Aryans were native to India? Where are these chariot evidence if chariots were native to India? But again, always keep looking at the game. So what are they saying? They're saying that these linguistic people who came to India brought horses with them, right? So therefore they're saying, if we couldn't find horses before, that's clear evidence that this is when these people came. Okay, so once they came, after that we will find horses, right? So if Aryans came in 1500 BC and they brought the horses, after 1500 BC will we find horse remains? We don't find them. When we bring this up as a challenge, then they say, oh wait, pots don't speak, which is their way of saying that, no, we were anyway linguistic theory. The archaeology has nothing to do with it. Why so we have gone this far. So now anyone is equipped. That is the other person talking about horses and chariots. If yes, then you give this argument. But if that person is just at that linguistic base, then don't let them trap you into horses and chariots. You've got to talk at that linguistic base itself, at PIE level. So because there are so many levels of argument. Then once the archaeological thing is done.
I would like to mention that anything like horse bones as well as any other animal matter, unless they were mummified and buried alongside kings of the time, it's very hard to get organic matter in terms of burials. We've discovered a lot of remains of humans in the Sonali and other Rakhigarhi, as well as we've even discovered genetic evidence, but that's because they were better preserved. And animals, especially when it came to wars, etc., simply were not. We've not, had a lot of oxen or cows, even though they are known across Dāsas as being worshipped of, we simply don't discover such organic matter since it's archaeologically quite difficult to recover such matters. It is understandable that even Witzel would, offer that sort of.
It's all red herrings in a spiral. So why do we need only bones as evidence? 10,000 years ago, I don't know if it's Bhimbetka or some other caves in India, on the paintings of that cave wall is an equid, is a clear and obvious equid.
Yes.
So that's it now. So I mean, why do we need horse bones?
We've also
That
got
caveman knew the equipment.
horsehair artwork, etc. We do have those things.
Exactly. So that's evidence enough anyway. Plus, so there's a lot of tautology to there. That's my point. This horse thing itself, we can unpack to see the kinds of stupidities. The chariot thing, the kinds of stupidities. Fire altars, each and every demand they were making. Linguists were making these material demands. And linguists were making conclusions, eliminations on the basis of either the absence of these material demands or the presence of these material demands. The moment you start noticing them from our independent point of view. So if we are looking at India from within, so we will first talk about this fact, right, that we have cave painting of horses. We will talk about that. We will talk about the fact that even in Tibet, you have this kind of mountain donkey or onager, I don't know what it's called. That's also an equid. This is what we will start talking about. Then they will say, oh, no, there's this thing called the true horse. Oh, what is the true horse? No, it is that kind which was used to be found in the steppe. And because we are now starting to train ourselves to notice this kind of shifting goalpost game, we need to know that the horse thing is not relevant at all. At every single stage, these are ornamentations they have built, which are easily collapsible. So that is my intent, to realize the layers and layers that have been piled on. And it hits to what you were talking about actually. Ki boss, PI is fine, Aryans migrating is fine. But all of this nonsense that we have of North Indians, South Indians, Aryans, Dravidians, genetic differences. Yes, what is this? So that is a story that they have made. Sorry?
Caste as well. We did unpack the fact that endogamy was used as caste supremacy, caste supremacy, which does not have any scientific basis as such. Endogamy has existed in the human populations across the board, across the world, across timelines, and as well as hierarchies have existed in societies across the board, and at no point have they been correlated in that sense.
Exactly.
So there's no genetic evidence of tying endogamy to caste supremacy as such. The same way that we question, when we left with the question in our last article saying, what did they actually bring? So now we'll say that, okay, they brought PIE, they brought the language. They just brought the language. They came in, now, even linguists, have gone down to no invasion. It's a trickling down. So a small minority came in and they brought a language.
It's laughable, on this. It should always be pointed out. It should always be pointed out. The serious argument that was made by Shri Rumila Thaparji with great earnestness, that, or maybe she was quoting another speculator called Ehret, but the speculation was, one single Afghan tribe interning in the Punjab region during a harsh winter could have transferred the Indo-European cultural kit to the entire damn subcontinent. They legitimately have speculated on this. That's how stupid it is.
So now when we come to PIE and the fact that you do posit the OIT framework, along with, of course, referencing all the other original scholars of it. What you're trying to basically ask people to look beyond the retrofitting of evidence into AIT or Aryan migration theory and see if the evidence actually fits, especially the linguistic evidence actually fits something that is an alternate to the AMT.
Yeah, absolutely. AI, AMT
Sorry, I lost you there. I lost you there for a bit. If you could just repeat that.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Yeah. So we have so many AIMT debunkers, right? People, I've also debunked AIMT, etc. The simple way to put it is that we have to debunk Proto-Indo-European.
Right.
So either debunk the notion that it came to India from outside, and therefore we would have to postulate that it is from India going out, or yes, you can debunk the notion itself that this is a false construct, And I think one of the analogies given is that it is like taking, I forget the analogy, but it's a very good analogy that what we've done with Proto-Indo-European, we've looked at its daughter languages.
Yes.
We've kind of imagined weird connections between these daughter languages, which anyway discernible to us in a different world, in a different era, by which time these daughter languages have interacted with a whole of other different language families. On the basis of that, we're thinking that, oh, then that means its mother would have been like that. So there is a lot of weird wonkiness to the concept itself. But yes, there are nuances to it. And when you call it wonkiness,
Yeah, and
at
like you
least.
mentioned, we've done that with genes, right? We've come to Lucy and her 7 daughters, and we've got those 3D imaginations of all of them, one with the blonde hair,
Yeah.
somebody else with the blue eyes, but at some point they come together, etc. So we've done that with genes, and somehow that's accepted theory right now, especially because genes are more tangible, so we accept them until an alternative is found. So is that how, because I understand that PIE has basically, it's like taking all of the existing Indian languages of Hindi and Avdi, Bhojpuri, Marathi, Gujarati, Bangla, all of these languages, and then creating Sanskrit out of that. I'm just leaving the Kannada and the Tamil language aside because, even though there are parallels and cognates, we don't really consider them Sanskritic right now. So, so it's like reconstructing Sanskrit out of these existing daughter languages, and we know that that's always going to be a flawed construct. It's not possible.
It's very interesting you say that. Actually, this is a very good point you raise, because this has been done. So when comparative linguists started forming their early intuitions about the interconnections of languages, and in fact, let us assume, yes, perhaps these were people who, well, they had a genuine curiosity. So they did want to know that, how do we know whether we're right or wrong? How do we know that this science we're building has any tether to it at all? What they were helped by was the fact that Latin was a language which they had attested evidence of. So they had records of how Latin was written, spoken, what its form was when it existed. And they also knew that Latin was the mother of some much later Romance languages. So what they did was they looked at these Romance languages and they tried to reconstruct Latin according to the rules of their field, which is comparative linguistics. And they came up with reconstructed Latin, and they checked, okay, so is it looking anything close to real Latin? And yes, they were actually fairly close. It wasn't way off. It was a fair fit, a working plausibility. So therefore, there is that level of legitimacy, let us call it, to the endeavor of comparative linguistics. But just because it hit to that degree in the case of Latin and the Romance languages, which had their own spatio-temporal nuances, and the spatio-temporal nuances of a question about Sanskrit, and that will be different about PH. So therefore, you cannot take it too far as a given. So I'm pointing that out just to say that comparative linguistics has tried to be self-honest. It's not a fraud endeavor.
Of course.
It might be a flawed endeavor.
No, of course, that's not specifically in context to PIE. Well, if we use Latin as a benchmark, then of course that does make sense. However, with Sanskrit, we know that it's a lot more complex and it's got a lot of rules, and we cannot arrive at the rules when we go with the daughter languages, because those rules do not apply to those daughter languages, and it's separate for all of them, right? So Sanskrit at least cannot be derived that way, and we do not know for Proto-Indo-European if that is the case or if it's similar to Latin. It is the assumption that these are.
And the landscape is always changing. So, Sanskrit ka you're mentioning. So anyway, it is now an accepted linguistic consensus that the Eastern Indo-Aryan languages of India, which would include, I think, Bhojpuri also, Bengali also, it is more or less consensus now that they actually haven't descended from Sanskrit. That there would have been a different stream of Indo-Aryan from which they would have descended, some kind of Eastern Indo-Aryan dialect. Whereas Sanskrit was the Rigvedic Sanskrit was the dialect of the Puru Bharats in the Punjab, Haryana area. And UP may it would have been a sister already from which these languages have come. So, already the landscape changes. And as I mentioned, there is the concept of Nostratic, so Nostratic being, the mother of PIE, Dravidian, a lot of other languages. But Abjuka, you mentioned, right, that we can go back in the genetics, we have been able to trace up to the level of Lucy, right? So you were asking that question, right? That with genetics, we've been able to go as far back as Lucy. So where do we get with language? Is that what you were
No, so
trying
my
to get at?
question was that, it's not scholastically, it's a probable path to take to, do the same thing with PIE. So I was just drawing an analogy that it's been done with genetics. Was that what drove linguists to attempt the same thing with PIE? So,
They see there are hooks and tethers. There are hooks and tethers. So, for example, if they in their field and their study, they have found that all the Indo-European languages, all the families, they share the root for wheel. So if it is determined that they all use by now different words for wheel, but if you trace within the rootage of their languages, then it's all coming from the same root. Okay, let us say if this is a linguistic fact that they're able to find out. This tells us something about material reality, about archaeology, because that means that the wheel was invented before they had started splitting up. If the wheel had been invented, I'm so sorry, there's this background noise.
that's fine.
If the wheel had been invented after disintegration, after breakup, there's no way that they would have the same root for wheel.
Yes.
Right? So these kind of investigations give them at least some tethers. So in material record, if we know when the wheel developed, when the spoke wheel developed, when the chariot developed, and we are able to do some kind of rigorous reconstructions which hold water. So there are tethers to be found. In fact, this is why PIE did not disintegrate in one go. It had at least 3 or 4 waves of disintegration lasting, spanning more than 500 years, more than 600 years, possibly 1000 years, by which time language itself changes so much. So the PIE that sent off the first wave was already very different to the PIE that would have sent off the last wave, for example. So that's how it becomes complicated, number one. But it becomes more infinitely complicated because you're alluding to this, that this is still an intellectual exercise. There is, language has an epistemological event horizon, which is just of the Holocene era, of since 10,000 BC odd. Prior to that, there is no meaningful speculation you can make on the nature of the language. It is proto. That's it. What do you say? Because language vanishes from any kind of conceivable record very soon, very quickly.
Yes.
Writing script is not there. Before the writing script, how do we visualize? What do we visualize? It's gone. It's so the epistemological event horizon is very tight. Beyond that, we can't speak.
Right. So when you posit, when you work on the framework for OIT, you suggested 2 means that we decide that PIE isn't by itself a flawed endeavor, or we consider PIE and we suggest that it moved outward. So
it's a journey for me also. My thoughts on this are evolving as I go along. The graph that you shared. So in that graph, what I do is that the OIT side, I approach from the opposite end. So the OIT side, we first look at, okay, wait, what is the Indian testimony of itself?
Let's just go to 0.
Just at the top, if you go, just the graph.
2 minus 5? Or the graph?
Just the top. The top.
Right.
Yeah, so you see at the bottom here, the story of India, 0. Yeah. Now, from -5 to 0 is what you are very rightly pointing out. At -5 is a seemingly harmless theory on language, right? But as you point out, that somehow this gets conflated with genetics, with caste, with archaeology, and this, and invasion, such that at 0, the story of India that we are told is a weird story of divisions and invasions and, oppression and hierarchy, etc. So what has happened over steps is that a seemingly harmless language skill has been used to give you the entire story of a subcontinent. And along the way, it has picked up friends from genetics, from everywhere. Now, this is the into India theory, the Aryan migration theory, invasion theory, whatever you may call it. But yes, over here, I have attempted the opposite, which is to say that, okay, let us start with understanding the Indian story as Indians knew it. So we will start with zero. Therefore, I'm not getting to OIT yet. When we start at zero itself, we will start noticing that, hey, we don't have any memory of migrations. We will start noticing that, oh, by the way, we do have lots and lots of stories of dispersals of waves of population outside our subcontinent. We have enough of those stories. And so on. We will have our own understanding of what Aryan
Can you exemplify some of the textual evidence of dispersion from India?
Yeah, sure. So I'll come to that. But this is just what our story is. So our story, Indians have known their story without any examination of text. So I'm saying that let us start there. And we notice that nothing is amiss. I mean, we have no reason to suspect what this site is telling us. But all right, so now let us go into investigation. So fine, you can skip the genetics part as well, but the textual evidence, and again, this is, it's a very important, frequently repeated quote. Conrad Elst has said this. He has said this about Talageri, sir, that Shrikant Talageri has single-handedly won the AIT debate. And the reason why this is said is because of the specific notices he has made on the review. So I'll talk about two of them, which for me are clinching enough. So in fact, I do not care about genetics anymore, about this, that. If someone is arguing against OIT to me, and knowing fundamentally that this is a linguistic matter, knowing fundamentally that I can play that horse and all thing, but there's no point to that, it is Talageri sir's evidence that needs refutation. So what is evidence number one? The Rigveda itself, there is a notion of a temporal gap in the Rigveda, where the earlier mandals of the Rigveda, and there are later mandals of the Rigveda, such that the earlier mandals were composed at a somewhat earlier era, and then there were maybe a few centuries of gap. So early Rigveda, later Rigveda. Now, Talageri sir has meticulously documented what are the place names, the river names, the flora, the fauna that we find in the early Rigveda and that we find in the later Rigveda. This is data, right? So it is not about debunking Talageri. It's there in the Rigveda, so someone will have to explain that part of it. But anyway, when he does this, now if Aryan invasion migration of any kind is true, what should we expect to find? In the early Rigveda, the people would be familiar with India's northwestern entry point because they're coming into India in the early Rigveda. So we should expect to find river names, place names, flora, fauna names of the modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, bordering up to Punjab area. That is what we should expect to find. And then by the later stage, we should expect that now they have, of course, come into India, right? They've conquered, they've invaded, they've migrated. So now we should be able to find that they have familiarity of the Gangetic plains. This is what we should expect from the data. The data shows exactly the opposite. In the early Rigveda, these people of the book are more familiar with the Gangetic plains. They have very little familiarity with the northwest of India. Northwest of India becomes familiar to them in the later Rigveda, in the later Rigveda. There you go. The game is over here itself. The game is over here itself. And it is so embarrassing. So Witzel had to have an amazing tango with Talageri sir about it, where Talageri sir noticed that the river name Jahnavi, which is a name for the Ganga, has been in later edition as well. There are Jahnavi or Jahnavi, but Jahnavi, I think is the name. There are Puranic stories for it as well. So it's a name for the Ganga, and it is found in the early Rigveda. So Witzel tries to argue against it. No, it's not a river name. And again, so this is the kind of thing, if you look at the matter yourself, you'll appreciate the absurdity of it more. But otherwise, it just sounds abstract. But then, it turned out that in Witzel's own previous writings, he had himself shared some kind of interpretation and fact that would support Talageri's view that this is the river Ganga.
He
If that kind
retracted
of
that, if I remember correctly. He apologized for it or something. I think
no, that's a
even
whole different story. That's a whole different story. That's a whole different story.
okay.
So, I mean,
I
Witzel's,
think Professor Bannon at
there is a
some point.
whole list of things we can talk about Witzelian U-turns. But anyway, my point is that यहाँ पे the game is over. If the people of the book were near the Ganga first
Like,
and
people of
then
the
near
book might be
Afghanistan,
confusing. We typically don't really refer to it
The
as.
Aryans, the Puru Bharats, the Aryans, yeah, the speakers of Vedic Sanskrit, those people.
So,
So,
so it's discovered that they were originally in the Gangetic Plains, and then in the latter half of the Rig Veda is when they got more familiar with the northwestern geography, flora,
yes,
and fauna, and all of the
yes.
markers that should be
But yes, I would propose that we don't say discovered. This is not a discovery. The
visible.
data is there. We
Yes,
found the data. It's so yeah, in that sense.
positive. That's what I suggest.
And he noticed Talageri sir just was the
Right,
first to look carefully enough.
right.
So एक तो ये है, this itself, the direction of it clinches the game for a lot of things. Now, I don't know, people might have this in their mind, there are a lot of things about the Mitanni evidence, right? You have these Mitanni people, the Hittite people, somewhere near Turkey, Sumeria, and etc. So there are implications on that as well, just from this late Rigveda and early Rigveda, and just from figuring out differences between the early Rigveda and late Rigveda. So I'm just throwing that out there for people to get a sense that a very simple framework made by Indologists. So it's not like some, Hindu nationalist is deciding this is early Rigveda, this is late Rigveda. This consensus of the field. And it actually proves hands down that the direction of travel during the Rigveda period of these guys was from within Ganga area outside. So now we are at the interesting and amazing situation. You remember at the beginning, I was saying that we have to either destroy PIE or we have to postulate a PIE homeland. And people might say that, wait a minute, why should we be bothered with that kind of thing? Now what we've done is now we've thrown the gauntlet back at them. Because if they want to continue arguing Aryan migration, they will have to explain why the hell did Sudas and his ancestors reach the Ganga and suddenly decide to do a U-turn back and come all the way back to northwest Punjab and Afghanistan. They will have to somehow, give an absurd explanation for this.
No,
So
no.
now we are starting to.
Let me counter you with the pop. I know the answer to this. I'm just countering it with a pop. So political gauntlet that is often thrown, that genetically we find a lot of mixing that is available in the northwestern India, in Afghanistan, in Punjab and Haryana, the Jats, etc. There's a lot of genetic mixing over there. So in terms of timeline, could you just elaborate on when this journey, the Rigvedic journey, was taken, and when we see the gene mixing, and now, where in terms of those markers is Aryan invasion based?
Yeah, so again, once in your head, this is, so people may call me a broken drum now. Once in your head, this is the clarity of this is internalized and shining bright, that the matter is linguistic. Then you can start piercing through any kind of genetic nonsense. So for example, what does Jat DNA have to do with a matter of Proto-Indo-European, which is of 5,000 years ago? Jat and Jat DNA has nothing to do with that matter. So I don't care. That over the past 2,000 years, what kind of endogamous, exogamous relationships, interrelationships have the Jats been up to that their DNA today looks like this?
So genes don't matter.
If the other side cares that this has a salience on Proto-Indo-European of 5,000 years ago, they must explain that. We should refuse to play that game where they will just keep popping up with any random thing that has conformed to their model. And now we struggle and we, get all restless. Oh, okay, how do I debunk this? Oh, wait, no. And first of all, even if we have to do that, notice that we are still waiting for their response on this Talageri evidence. So ठीक है, हम थोड़ा homework करते हैं. We'll try to find out an answer, sir, for the genetic question you have posed. What do you have to say for the evidence we have posed? That's also number two. Then ye narratives that you're saying, I mean, each and every new paper debunks an old narrative. These are
Right,
statistical rigor,
to
how much
sort of
is there, how
answer
much is
that,
not there.
this
So
was
people should
1500 years
follow
ago, right?
Ashish Kulkarni, right? So
Yes.
Genetics 1. I mean, he's doing primary research in the matter. The more he goes into, and respect for him, by the way. So he's approaching it with his compass. So for Ashish, the way I am is for me, the matter is linguistic alone. Ashish is not asking a linguistic question. He is currently, I mean, I'm not trying to speak on his behalf, so sorry, Ashish, but he is very laser focused on the genetic matter, that is what he's understanding. And the more he's looking at it, any broad genetic binary that is being peddled around, he does original research, investigation, finds out that's not the case. So the genetic thing they will keep doing. It's not going to stop. It's not going to stop. When the genetic thing started by them preambling already and saying that we are going to, yet to be found genetic.
Right.
So दूसरी side, if they are playing with yet to be found genetic evidence, then how long will I keep talking to them about what they've already found right now? It's a losing game.
Right. So genetics does not matter at this point, and that's accepted by linguists. Sorry?
It is salient. Genetics is salient.
Genetics may be salient to a genetic debate. To PIE, the way that you framed Shrikant Talagari's questioning of the model itself, that still remains a question unanswered by that hypothesis.
That's there, but I mean, just again
again, there's no genetic basis for that questioning also either, right? It's
that question, but just so that people, I don't give the wrong impression to people. So, for example, in Europe, we know for sure that there was, let us call it, an Indo-European invasion, which is to say that in the archaeological record of Europe, in the burial patterns of Europe, in the linguistic replacement of previous languages in Europe, and all of this very neatly intersecting with the replacement of previous European genetic lineages by new lineages that have just come from the steppe region. All of this is in very neat and quite consistent corroboration. So definitely there were people from the steppe who brought language and genetics to Europe, and those expanded such that today they are the defining characteristic of European language and European genetics. So, just so that people don't think I'm saying that no, these things have no relation at all.
So my question was primarily from the timeline perspective, that when we discuss the invasion as such, the original timeline itself was only about 1500 years ago, right? 2000 years ago. That's when we see that migrations happened. There was genetic mixing, and then there was a sudden stratification about 2000 years ago after their coming in and settling down or whatever. And how does that contrast with the Rigvedic linguistic?
Fair, Ji. So, a joke comes to my mind. I think maybe you know this also. So this dude, he sees that one of his friends is searching for something under the street lamp. So he goes to his friend. Sorry?
It's an Akbar Birbal joke, usually.
Possible, maybe. So he asks his friend, what are you doing? So he says that I've lost my key. I'm looking for it. So he says, okay, where did you lose it? So his friend points to some dark area there. He says, I lost it there. So he asks them, why are you looking for it here? He says, because the light is here. So this is what is happening with genetics. And the best example of that is that, again, if you think of the way I'm trying to get us to think, so it starts with a linguistic theory, they pile on all kinds of archaeological red herrings on top of it, such that they are anyway waiting for any genetic information to corroborate with their model. Therefore, it is but obvious, and it is a guarantee that whatever timeline they're working with, as soon as there is some genetic migration during that timeline, that is, if it is found, they will say that is proof. So the model already existed that Aryans came into India in the 2nd millennium BC, which, just for ease, I also say, let us say 1500 BC, just to split it evenly. That model already exists.
Sorry, I said
Okay?
1500 years ago, I meant 1500.
Sure.
And that's
So that model already exists. Now, the fact is that people need to understand that this model is disproven by the rules of the game, because the rules of the game are linguistic, philological, and to a degree archaeological. So on those bases, we anyway debunk the idea of 1500 BC ingress. So the model does not exist. But they say that because in 1500 BC they find genetic ingress, it proves the model. It makes no sense. For example, people should be aware of the Saraswati evidence. So here, a fantastic paper by Shri Meg Kalyanasundaram and Shri Madogna Sastri, it is called Saraswati in the Mahabharata. That is the name of their paper, where they have done very extensive research of all evidence in the Mahabharata. And in the Mahabharata, there is also a great account of Balram's journey, where Balram, I think, journeys from Dwarka to Haridwar or somewhere in the mountains. So he follows the Saraswati. Now, in the Mahabharata, through these kinds of accounts, we find that the Saraswati has stopped meeting the ocean. So in the Mahabharata, it is now disappearing into the desert at a place which is therefore called Vinasa. And in the paper Saraswati in the Mahabharata, so they plot it all out to give a sense fairly of what is the Saraswati's geology, hydrogeology in the Mahabharata. Now, and honestly, it's a very stupid thing. So I don't know if you want to get into it, but the Ghaggar Hakra and the Saraswati are the same. And if people, there's a whole thing we can do there. But anyway, so the Ghaggar Hakra, we know it's a drying timeline. It's a real river, so we can investigate. So therefore, we can actually figure out that when was the Saraswati likely to have been in the kind of state which is talked about in the Mahabharata. Rigved mein Saraswati to bhaiya Saraswati hai. She's one of the three goddesses that is invoked. She's the Giribhya Samudrat, from the mountain to the sea, and she's the bedrock of civilization in the Rigved.
Yes.
Therefore, that has to be before the time when Saraswati dried up. Now, if we find geological evidence that by 1900 BC, the Saraswati no longer met the ocean, for sure. Therefore, that Rigvedic era has to have been sometime before that. Now, if it is sometime before that, that means that at that time only, the Aryans were already in India. So then why do we keep talking about the 1500 BC date? So that is, you see, the model has fallen. It's collapsible. So we have already disproven the 1500 BC date, but they will continue to look at genetic influx and say, no, it proves the 15. What do I do now with the genetic influx? Yes, maybe some dudes came, but they were not the Aryans. They were not the Saraswati inhabitants. They were not the fire altar bringers, which is where our article therefore ends. What did they bring? So मान लिया, yes. Genetic data is genetic data. So pods don't speak, but genes do speak, in the sense that if you find genetic there, you know that there was a human there. So yes, some humans came in 1500 BC. That's it.
Yes, I don't think that's debatable.
Amazingly enough, Indian tradition remembers that, right? So in Puranic tradition, it attests it on its own, that sharks, hounds, a lot of other such. So khud hi mante
hain. Well, they were the invaders, but they did indigenize, and I don't know
exactly.
how that came to again give us the Brahmins and the caste divides that are postulated based on those.
In fact, we can kind of talk about that, because again, so the absurdity of the matter has to be realized. They have forced themselves into a corner where they have made this ridiculous assertion that a small demographic minority somehow can transfer its entire language and cultural kit on an established demographic heavyweight like India was, and a civilizational stalwart like India was, Harappa and all that. It was high civilization. So they have made this ridiculous assertion that somehow a small group of people can come and change the landscape. So now they are stuck trying to defend their own tail. This is why invasion becomes migration, migration becomes trickling in, at what point do we start noticing all those stages, denial, bargaining, anger. So they're going through the entire stages of grief. It's going on, and genetics, I think, is that last one, after this is acceptance, I think.
All right. So do you want to discuss animal genetics at this?
It is salient. I mean, definitely it is. So, because if we are saying that human genetics are a marker of language, animal genetics can be a marker of humanity. And therefore, A is to B, B is to C, so A is to C. The law of transitivity applies. So on genetics, yes, the one that is very interesting to me is the fact that the Bos indicus, the Indian cow, has no foreign admixture. And again, so it's so amazing to be doing at least some primary research on these things. So there's this amazing book. It's called an introduction, the Oxford Introduction to PIE Reconstruction, and PIE Lifestyle. Okay, so it is by these prominent linguists, J.P. Mallory and something Adams. So it's a big tome where gets into PIE reconstruction. Their conclusion about who the PIE people were, that they were a Neolithic people with extensive engagement with animal husbandry and cattle domestication. This is their conclusion, their linguistically informed conclusion about who the PIE people were. They actually, Mallory Adams themselves, right? They might have known the horse. So turns out that the leading guys today are not even talking about horse and chariot. So that is how abreast we have to keep, so we can keep talking about, let's say Max Muller's date, but then we'll have to deal with horse and chariot. Horse and chariot, so these guys have gone further ahead now. They're talking about other things. So anyway,
sorry, like I said, I was throwing a pop political, assertion into the mix, nothing to do with the scholastic evidence right now. That's why I mentioned important evidence.
It is very important actually, and like comparative linguistics, for example, as a field itself, it cannot comment on absolute chronologies. It can only comment on relative chronologies. By definition of the field itself, it cannot say the exactly 5000 BCs when PI existed. It can only kind of tether it to some other relative chronology. But anyway, the point being that so now leading guys are saying that cattle domesticators the Aryans, Neolithic economy the Aryans ki. So if at all that is true, then Indian Bos Indicus जब आए थे वो India, तो Bos Indicus के साथ उनकी cows ने would have interbred, na? So Bos Indicus would have had some foreign admixture. It has zero foreign admixture, but Bos Indicus is found in Ukraine and Turkey, and so on. So definitely the Indian cow went there. Cows are not nomadic. Indian cows though will not even get off the street. So definitely it was some humans that took them with
so later evidence, of course, we have, like, I think we've had this discussion offline. So like I mentioned, Pericles of the Erythraean Sea, of the Greek sailor, anonymous Greek sailor, who was basically making merchant notes of what was going on the ship from where to where. And there it's mentioned that, of course, Indians were, however, the timeline is a much later one. So it was when, the Indian trade with Rome was at its peak around 1500 years ago, 1000 years ago.
Pliny ke time pe, I think. Pliny the Elder.
Yeah, Pliny was quite
Pliny.
Yes. Apart from him, I think even well, there were quite a lot of people very disturbed at the amount of gold that was coming into India. But yes, it was mentioned in the Pericles that, we were transporting cows, oxen, peacocks for the kings abroad that they were quite in demand. The animals were quite in demand. On ships, it was maritime trade also involved them going there. So, but the timeline is, of course, a lot later.
It's an interesting, this thing. And the fact is that, we are not playing the game like they are. No? So, this cow thing, some random person will think, oh, wait a minute, but if this is the case, does it mean that there could have been an Indian migration out of it? We are not led with a priori thinking where we've already made some kind of model.
So
Just
is it
that,
time to do
right?
that?
So ours
Is
is
it time to actually do that?
it's happening. It's
Yeah,
happening.
right.
It's happening. I mean, there are, of course, there are the genuine leading scholars as well. But I do think recently, in fact, or maybe because I'm in the middle of it, so I notice it more. But on Twitter, online, there are independent researchers, independent thinkers, people of their own curiosity and intelligence who are, pointing all sorts of holes from every angle. Everywhere you look, there are collapsible pillars. Everywhere you look, there are collapsible pillars. So Kiran, I mentioned his name. There's so much he talks about, on agriculture, about the absurdity of this demographic upturning. I do think that perhaps at this stage on Twitter, there are times when he's making observations on relationship between Southern Indian languages, Dravidian languages,
Yes,
and
yes.
Indo-European languages.
Sanskrit.
I do think he is the things he's saying. He's at the cutting edge of it. I don't think these are previously known or discovered connections. He's the first one doing this.
I'm certain
So
that any
it's happening.
discovery is again going to be, anybody even making those connections will just brush it off because of the establishment of the tautological framework of the IE. So, of the Aryan Dravidian divide. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
that's
I mean,
why.
most fun. Abhi to where we have reached today is that we can make the most watertight theory possible. But
Right.
they will say, "Acha, where is the genetic evidence?" They will say, "You show us the haplogroup."
No,
But
I mean,
when
that
you
would be
show us
like you
the
said, that we can throw the gauntlet back at them. However, it's interesting that you call it cutting edge where he is, whereas anybody
yes,
postulating AIT, AMT, I don't think AIT exists anymore or is accepted anymore, but AMT is going to say that it's too far-fetched. So, while you say that thinking out of that framework is
so
going to be
please
cutting
repeat.
edge.
Could you please repeat?
So
Anyone who
I
believes?
was just saying that it's
Come again?
interesting that you mentioned Kiran's research as being
Okay.
cutting edge, whereas somebody coming at it from the AMT framework would suggest that it's far-fetched. So
Absolutely.
yes, and so that is that.
But the walls are cracking. ऐसी बात नहीं है. I mean, as I mentioned, Tonoyan Belyayev, Igor Tonoyan Belyayev. He's doing some fascinating work into the nature of even mature Harappan language. He's drawing correlations between phases of the Harappan archaeology and phases of Indo-European dispersal from India to the rest of the Eurasia. And there have been, some linguistic arguments that have been propped up as they eliminate India from consideration. So they've been propped up as if, oh, this argument means India just cannot be the homeland, which is not an argument given for anywhere in the world, but somehow India is disproven by linguistic arguments. Some of them depend on the kind of relationship between Indo-European languages, Indo-Aryan and Dravidian, where the reality is that though you may find Dravidian and Indo-Aryan influences in Indo-Aryan, so there are Dravidian influences in Indo-Aryan, but there are no Dravidian influences in all the other Indo-European language families.
True.
Now, this is used to say that therefore the more likely possibility is that Indo-Aryan came here and interacted with Dravidian. Okay, sounds good, sounds intuitive. So it will take someone like a Talageri sir in his own research, in his own observation to figure out that, okay, they say that Indo-European was born in the steppe. Okay. Steppe ke hi upar is the Finno-Ugric language family, such that they would have been neighbors. So if that is the case, we would find a Finno-Ugric evidence in all the Indo-European languages. But we don't. We find it only there. So if the logic is correct, then that itself is falsified, right? Collapsed again. But chalo theek hai. Now there is Tonoyan Belyayev. Tonoyan Belyayev is arguing, number one, that why are we assuming Dravidian is a substrate, coming to what I was saying there.
Yeah.
So he's saying that it can be an abstract. So he's making arguments that it could be an abstract. Plus, he's actually finding evidence for Dravidian in the other Indo-European languages. So that's another. So it's they have built so many pillars. Luckily for us, they are tautologically built. So sometimes you topple one and it falls like a house of cards. But it's the landscape they put out is so vast by now. And these are individual researchers. One Tonoyan Belyayev, one Shrikant Talageri sir. 200 years of German Indologists and British Indologists. So the body of things that they've. Yeah.
So I do think, and now you know that I approach it way more from an education sociological aspect and effect, cause and effect. Coming from the colonial and racist origins of the ideas themselves to how they affect us today in a journey of India rediscovering her own heritage as such. I do think that from scholastic pursuit, what you've said is, it seems very valid at this time when people like Dr. Elst or Shrikant Talagere postulate, when they counter those hypotheses, it's going to be accepted because on the basis of a pure academic pursuit, there's no way to falsify what they bring to the table. However, when it comes to acceptance in the mainstream, because we've been divided for so long on the basis of something that is really a scholastic hypothesis that could very well have been poked holes into much earlier. We've imbibed that and formed all of these sort of identities based that we now need to defend because they've become part of our culture of what we hold as our tradition and heritage. It's going to be very difficult to like the tautological framework, like you said, would fall over by one card falls and the rest of it collapses like a house of cards. But the sociological impact is very deep, and I believe that it is much more lasting than a mere scholastic.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
Tomorrow, Witzel could wake up tomorrow and say that, yes, I believe in indigenous Aryans. But in India, our sociological divides will still take time, nonetheless.
Right. So I think what we can just say is that it's extremely ridiculous, like we've discussed several times, to have those divides in the first place. Nowhere else do we see those divides based on either genetics, archaeology, or linguistics, creating those sorts of divides and ensuring that somebody looks from an outsider perspective, tells us that, hey, this is Brahminical patriarchy. Even though we've seen society across religion, across geographies, having hierarchical structures, nobody actually comes and says that, hey, this was at some point this was Celtic supremacy or a Viking supremacy or any of that. However, we accept those things. We've imbibed them so much as means of. It's helped, of course, by the American template of racism and the CRT.
Yeah, of course. It maps so neatly. Yeah.
Yes, so the template of CRT has been very thoroughly applied. I think it's way more obvious.
I think now it will be thorough. They will begin applying it now. CRT, because CRT has been well baked in the American oven. So abhi tak to all the AIT and all this genetic shit that we're seeing, it's now Harvard is at the front of this kind of genetic divisive stuff that's coming out for India, right? So that's come from Harvard. David Reich and co, Audrey Truschke, Witzel. This is a Harvard cabal, So I think now, if we're not careful, they will start it actually in earnest. And they've started now collecting samples of Indian populations. Ab kya cuts they will find, what kind of narratives can come out. Tomorrow's scroll will talk about, the how in one village, there is these, Brahmin oppressors and this, that, and genetic unka difference dikh raha hai hame. So it can get nasty.
No, I think that's already happened. That's very well established to have, Brahmin children were killed in UP, and that never gets coverage. Two children were killed for the sole reason that they were Brahmin, right? And that keeps happening across the country. However, with the imposition of something like CRT and imbibing that sort of hatred towards a particular people based on assumed, concentrations of caste divides from hundreds of years ago. That's something that is why I think this discussion is extremely
Parag Agarwal, when he took over Twitter, right? So someone was like, this is Brahmin patriarchy.
Yes, I remember the lady she had a brother anti-India front. It was amazing. But then it's not new to Twitter, because when Jack Dorsey had come to visit India, that same person, actually, I think it was, that was Anna Vegetal. She recently actually also called out anti-Christian stances of the country. She was the one who actually met Jack Dorsey and was holding up the Smash Brahminical Patriarchy placard. So there are these things that it's quite easily imbibed because we have a huge diaspora population, and I think Ruchir Sharma observed this, policy professional and analyst. He observed that it's a very strange phenomenon that when we see the Turkish diaspora outside, or the Chinese diaspora outside, or anybody Iranian, etc., they seem to get way more nationalistic after a few even 1 or 2 generations down the line. They try to hold on to their roots. Whereas with Indians, there is this deeply ingrained inferiority that they are trying to get rid of. And as soon as they go abroad or form the diaspora population, they tend to disregard any reason for adherence to a cultural similarity with India. So that's a very interesting thing. And so knowing that such large populations study abroad and go to these universities where CRT is actually an accepted, established academic construct, it's quite easy to see how AIT fits into that. So I think it's very necessary to first dismantle it. And I was very interested in seeing that IIT Kharagpur did come out with that calendar that questioned the Aryan migration theory. Of course, like you mentioned, there were flaws in that. However, no academic institution has actually taken up that progress. Even I think Meg Kalyanam and Manukna Shastriji, you mentioned, they have also approached the government websites to question them on the Aryan invasion. However, it's so
I think 1 or 2 things, if I remember correctly, they managed to get some things pulled down also from government websites.
That's what I meant to say.
Especially Meg Kalyan, though he's doing everything. In fact, I don't know. So, have you seen this video of Sai Deepak and Shashi Tharoor? There's a video of it's a book launch event for Shashi Tharoor's book.
Yes, I have seen Shashi Tharoor's book launch. He never read Sai Deepak.
At the end of that. So at the end of that book, Meg Kalyan sir is there. At the end of that video, he's there asking a question to Shashi Tharoor.
I see.
And you should take a look at that also. It's a very intelligently crafted and question that he asks. So, and of course, original researcher and all that.
Yes, because I think after that, Sai Deepak did a separate video where he called out several of the loopholes that even Shashi Tharoor mentioned. Even from his reading of Vivekananda, it seemed like he was saying the exact opposite of what Swami Vivekananda had said at one point. So, of course, those things happen. But my interest in this is from the impact that it has already had on Indian society, and the impact that I expect will get. Well, I hope not, but it seems like there is the possibility of it getting much, much worse because we live in a rapidly growing population of those consuming internet content and information as such. And we can see that the biases on digital media ensure that information is biased a certain way. Over big tech platforms, etc. And so when they come across this information, and everybody's curious about origins, about heritage, about history, unless counter propositions come up as rapidly as established ones come out. So it's very easy to build on something that exists, right? So the kind of content that they can keep on churning out based on one original hypothesis is much easier than somebody doing original research and coming out with. However, without that happening, I believe a lot more people are going to be exposed to unsubstantiated hypothesis as established fact. We've seen so many of these myths, but it can be unsubstantiated propositions, but it's repeated loud enough, and then it's just assumed to be established facts, and then more facts or any other evidence is sort of piled onto that existing thing. So since Aryan invasion is something that's been so deeply ingrained in us, it's actually heresy, even academic or definitely societal heresy to question it at this point. So,
and I mean, I don't know, you've alluded to it. It's a long journey to go because I honestly believe that even if we might reach a stage of it's nullified, it becomes a obsolete theory, Aryan invasion migration, such that the whole concept of PIE, all of that goes away. somehow I think we will still then have to deal with the bugbear of this caste system being a narrative
Absolutely.
for everything that's wrong with Indian society. And that anyway will still be, it won't need anything but genetics. So on caste system, then, it will be, I don't know, kind of like
No,
a
I don't think genetics
dystopian game.
provides that evidence. So I don't believe that it needs genetics. I think that's a separate discussion that we can have actually.
It's
If we pass through it,
if caste system divisiveness dependent on the genetic fact being true, we wouldn't have a problem. The point is that it
yes,
will
it's
be
not true.
used to yeah, sorry,
It's not true.
sorry.
So, I mean, the fact that it's not true can be proven right outright. So the genetic evidence for
I
that
agree.
does not exist.
I wish that would be the case and that would suffice, but I am very doubtful. I mean, ancestral North Indian, ancestral South Indian, bol ke, ab now people have started thinking that, oh, North Indians have different DNA, South Indians have different DNA.
Exactly. People
I mean,
believe
so
that, and
I'm
they
just worried.
point to the certain phenotypical characteristics, stating that hey, North
Which have nothing to do with DNA. So it's again, it's misconceptions, right? So that's what I'm saying. It doesn't matter actually ANI, ASI. The people themselves have taken it, ran with it. Now using it on their own way, it will start getting mapped onto other things, or skin color, to this, to that. So
exactly
we are
skin
getting
color,
divided
eye
anyway.
shape. Is it not
It's like
obvious?
matches. Every new genetic data will be like a matchstick into the cinder block of Indian diversity.
No, so I would actually like a sort of maybe I will ask Ashish Kulkarni to come onto the channel as well, and then discuss the Aryan Dravidian divide in terms of genetics and what it actually means. Because civilizationally, as we discussed, there were literally zero problems with
But
civilization.
may I understand? So, why would you frame it in this way when you say the Aryan Dravidian divide in terms of genetics? So, what has led you to this association to
So
begin with
these are
of
conversations.
Aryan Dravidian with genetics?
As you know, I mean, since we've co-authored the article, etc., and there's a stance that we postulate there. So I've definitely had a question from a lot of people just putting that question that North Indians or people from the northern parts of India do look different phenotypically from those in the southern parts, but they never they forget the western and the eastern halves completely. I don't know where I would belong, because I don't belong to either of those spheres, but we'll just forget about the tribes, the Gorns, the Bhils, and everybody else, but we'll discuss these genes, the ASI and the ANI genes, and how they basically are very separate people, and that should be obvious through phenotypical traits. So that's why I asked
I
that.
mean, so, but then that is, I'm sorry, but isn't that people just being ignorant about the facts of the matter? I mean, that's like thinking that somehow,
But
neutrinos hit my
causation
body
does,
and that's how I get gravity. It's wrong, right?
correlation does, get confused with causation so often.
Not
So
talking about correlation. No. But the understanding that phenotype and DNA are something we can talk of. It's like this is a biological flaw. People are misunderstanding the scientific thing
no,
itself. No,
phenotypical
this
and
is wood.
genotypical
This is cake.
correlations do exist. So there is phenotypical and genotypical. I mean, genotypes do lead to
Genotype.
expression.
Yeah, fair enough. So, but okay, fair enough. And but if people are listening, also, just this is just a matter of understanding the fundamentals of the subject matter. We are talking about empty DNA, Y-DNA, which are lineages of genetic traits passed on from mother to daughter, which are move across the planet, and that's those trails. That thing and that aspect as a genetic information and data point has nothing to do with phenotype. So anyway, to be talking of these two as if they are related, chalo, that is a flaw. Then secondly, to then think that North Indian, South Indian, the genetic bit has anything to do with Aryan Dravidian. So, and you keep mentioning, right, the timelines. So, ancestral North Indian also came to India 9,000 years ago. Dravidian as a language is attested 2,000 years ago. So anyone who's connecting these two things will have to explain what happened in the 7,000 years. What is the assumption you're kind of jumping over, right? So I'm just pointing out that there are fundamental issues already. in the framing.
So, like you said, obviously the plasticity of phenotype is something that you would know that it's not directly correlated to genotype, but that's not something that is present in the mainstream. I know because we've studied the Punnett square as
There you go. Exactly.
biotechnology.
Which is why I said that
but,
genetics will be used anyway. It won't matter whether the genetic fact is true or not. On top of that, people will take phenotype, and that's why people have accepted also. Now, why have people accepted this
that's exactly
thing
my
in their head?
point. When you want to trace
Ancestral north,
the bias, it's
ancestral
very
south. Yeah, exactly. So the truth of the genetic fact
they're
won't matter.
not
The
after the
intent, the
truth. They're
divisiveness.
not after the truth. It's more a matter of confirmation bias and validation of something that they've already
Yeah.
imbibed, which is why I think the information going out there itself is extremely dangerous. When we keep on arguing from a genetic perspective, and we keep on arguing from linguistically, like you said, there's so many loopholes that it's been almost accepted as being disproven. However, every sort of new scientific evidence, if it keeps being fit into that frame and discussed,
Exactly. That's
even when we actually, like you said, that if we nullify this, it's still going to exist in people's heads, because now it'll go from gene to becoming cultural. Now we can say that Dravidian is a separate culture.
I'm sorry, to anyone who's listening also, and who in their mind have even toyed with the idea of starting to associate these genetic migration patterns, Y-DNA, mtDNA, with phenotype, etc. So number one, congratulations. You have now approximated yourself to the best of these race scientists of 100, 200 years ago. Number two, I hope you are just one step ahead now, and you discover, as the Swedish discovered, that actually on the classifications they were using, they were the same racial type as these Africans who they thought they were superior to. So I hope you then make that full journey and reach some kind of.
But as you know, I think we've discussed some papers where eugenics is, sort of coming back in fashion as being accepted as pushing boundaries of curiosity and questioning. So
thanks to these, I don't know, thanks to these
scientists, yes, I do believe some things should be questions also. But anyway, well, it's been a fascinating conversation. I know you and I could do this for a really long time. I believe I'm going to have some trouble uploading this video on YouTube.
Right, yeah.
Thank you so much for joining today. And
all right, thank you.
We'll
thank you. Bye-bye.
Back soon. Thank you.